gossip. Usually it's negative. Did you hear what so-and-so did?
The first public shooting on record by a woman took place during Sunday school on the 4th of July in 1886. Though this story is a little less gruesome than the stories I normally talk about, this whole story is kind of intense and oddly mysterious. Another reminder about how much safer those God-fearing times when decent folk believed in things like honor and virtue were. But before we get started, remember to like, subscribe, and share with 1,193 friends. Or my boss will put on that feigning happiness smile she puts on because of low view counts. And she ain't fooling no one with that, just like this boss shtick ain't fooling no one. I want to remind you to keep in mind that we're talking about 1886 South Carolina and not modern times. So while we may not necessarily agree with their mores or their point of view, their mores and their point of view are 100% what we're talking about here. So let's keep that clearly in mind throughout this video. That is, in a manner of speaking, the story is from a different world. Miss Emma Connelly was a beautiful woman in her early 20s who lived in the Hunter's Chapel neighborhood of Midway, South Carolina, a small town in 1886 that is still tiny today. A reporter from the Augusta Chronicle is quoted in the Abbeville Messenger describing her as, quote, a well-formed young lady of medium height with brown eyes deep set, high cheekbones, and a sweet, interesting face. In 1886, Emma was engaged to her second cousin, John A. Steedley, who was close to her age. They'd known each other since they were kids, and he'd admired her for some time. But in May or June, he said something to a friend of his in confidence about Emma, and that friend unfortunately divulged that secret. It's unclear who the friend told, but he either told Emma directly or got it back to her somehow. To Emma and her friends, John had been, quote, putting out false and damaging reports, or in modern parlance, talking shit. But just to be clear, some of that talking was written. So reports is kind of apt, despite John's denial. Though, in fairness to him, he denied it before he wrote several letters. So it's hard to say how hypocritical this gesture is, and how much it's just the action of a desperate man, but he definitely wrote several letters about the gossip after he proclaimed in the newspaper that he had only spoken to a friend about this issue. Feeling betrayed and as if her reputation was damaged, Emma gave John back his ring and called the engagement off. John supplicates and tries to win her favor back to no avail. A few days later, around the 5th or 6th of June, Emma's brother W.T. Connolly and his friend Mr. A.L. Ott jump John. Mr. Connolly puts a gun in John's face and threatened to kill the young man if he moved. Ott put his hands on his gun as well, signaling that he was also ready to shoot the man. Then, they horsewhipped or cowhided John because of the, quote, false and damaging slander of Emma. They hit him all over the face and body until the whip was completely worn out, about 30 lashings. On June 7, 1886, in News and Courier, John's cowhiding was reported. The author focuses on details like the men spent $2.50 on the whalebone whip they used, and how everyone thought it was justified. The article also reported that John apparently spoke with the trial judge, who informed him that if he pressed charges on Messrs. Connolly and Ott, punishment would probably be indicted for circulating reports equally false and damaging concerning persons. In other words, the judge tells him that if he tried to press charges, he would be punished for in essence slandering Emma. So after this, John becomes, quote, reconciled to his fate. John's reply was printed in News and Courier on June 23rd. He is mad because he feels slandered and misrepresented, and also portrayed as the villain when he was the one who was attacked. He writes, Connolly did strike me several blows with the whip, the cost of which I do not know or care. And about, quote, circulating false and damaging reports concerning Connolly's sister Emma, John wrote, that is untrue. All that I said was in a confidential way, and I had no desire or expectation of doing Miss Connolly any damage by speaking of her to my friend. But unfortunately for me and him, he divulged the secret. And now, since the lady and her friends have taken the steps they have, in justice to myself, I must say that her mother knows the whole truth and knows that I have not lied. Everyone can see that your correspondent was not disposed to do me justice in that report. I hope in the future, when using my name through the papers, he will be careful to say nothing but the truth. Time will tell whether I am reconciled to my fate or not, and as to his statement about my calling on a trial justice, as other statements made, either willfully or negligently untrue. Now, Mr. Editor, I hope in justice to me you will publish this. And the response from the Bamberg correspondent of the News and Courier on June 25th stated, in justice to your correspondent and Mr. Steedley, it is necessary to state that the report made concerning the cowhiding of Mr. John Steedley was founded entirely upon information given your correspondent by a gentleman who he believes to be reliable. His statements have been confirmed by other parties, and your correspondent has neither seen nor heard a denial of the facts as reported until Mr. Steedley's card appeared in the News and Courier yesterday. It was far from the intention of your correspondent to do Mr. Steedley an injustice, and it is hoped that he may be able to clear up the matter satisfactorily. Her father is the something of the town of Midway, South Carolina. I think it reads Marshall because it starts with an M, has 7 letters, and contextually makes sense, but by all means, if you can read it or find a different source or even just agree with me based on my logic, please comment below and let me know. But likely because of whatever his job was. In late June, her dad broke up a fight where one man tried to shoot another, so Mr. Connolly confiscated the man's gun and put it in his pocket. When he brought it home, he laid it on a sideboard. The gun is a .38, probably a .38 Smith & Wesson 2nd or 3rd model revolver, which honestly has a pretty massive bullet for a handgun and holds about 5 rounds. Thomas, one of Emma's brothers, showed Emma a blackguard letter from John on Friday, July 2nd, 1886. They discuss it for a bit, but eventually turn their thoughts to other matters. That is, until Sunday, July 4th. The Columbus Inquirer-Sun reported that Emma, quote, took a seat directly behind John. She then drew a revolver and, placing it to the back of her victim's head, fired. His brains splattered the pew and the floor of the sacred edifice. Women screamed and fainted, and the congregation dispersed in confusion. Now, while that description paints the picture most of us were expecting, this is likely the result of news traveling from Midway, South Carolina, all the way to Columbus, Georgia, and getting messed up in translation. However, to a modern audience, the true series of events is probably quite a bit more shocking than that. So what actually happened is that on the morning of the 4th of July, Emma took the gun from the sideboard, and somewhere between pilfering the pistol and reaching the church, she cocks the gun. Using the front door, she walked into Sunday school at Hunter's Chapel Baptist Church with her arms folded, concealing a cocked gun. She slid into the pew right behind John A. Steedley and almost immediately shot him in the back near his left shoulder blade, likely while she was still standing. John stood up and did his best to walk out the back door and pull a pistol from his pocket at the same time. Emma chased him as he fled, firing at him twice, but thankfully her gun misfired and she avoided hurting anyone else in the crowded church. John made it outside the church and down the stairs before falling forward onto his face, dying a few minutes later a few feet from the front steps. 2 men, J.B. Hunter and Lawton Connolly, a judge and Emma's father respectively, chased Emma and disarmed her. She didn't resist being detained and voluntarily turned herself over to J.B. Hunter, who was a trial judge, which allowed her to avoid going to jail, at least until her inquest. While everyone was understandably experiencing a little adrenaline rush, most people were not that fazed, or as the Indianapolis Journal writes, there was great excitement among the women and children who were present at the time, but no panic. Some such action as this had been looked for by the people of the neighborhood for the last month. Indeed, by many persons, it is regarded as the only proper end to the scandal. From a modern perspective, it seems kind of crazy, but this sentiment is echoed in many, but not all, of the news stories about the case. For example, a journalist in News and Courier writes, there is no question in the mind of anyone around Midway that she was justified in shooting Steedley, and none of his friends will make any effort to have her detained. But the next morning, July 5th, Emma, her attorney named Mr. Williams, her father, brother, and several friends went to Barnwell, where Emma surrendered herself to the authorities in good spirits. A reporter for the Augusta Chronicle who knows her brother interviewed her while her party awaited the train despite the fact that she had denied other journalists a similar statement. She stated with pure sang-froid that I have nothing to regret about it. She explained that she had just punished a cowardly man for injuring her reputation. She continued to explain that she has the utmost respect for John's mother, Mrs. Steedley. She says the woman has a great reputation in the neighborhood. But she also clearly and coldly stated, I killed him because I felt it my duty, and I did not want to put my father or brother in the position that I am now in. My name, and that's all a woman has been vilified, and I have wiped out the stain with the blood of my traducer. An inquest was held that day by Justice D.J. Rowe and a grand jury. John's body was examined by Dr. J.F. Baggett. He found that John had been shot from above with a gun pointing nearly straight down. The bullet entered near his upper left shoulder blade. The .38 caliber bullet went between his 2nd and 3rd ribs in a downward direction about 2 feet headed towards his stomach, ending a couple inches under his belly button. The testimony of 2 witnesses are also heard at this inquest, Jacob Rentz and James Carter, both of whom basically confirm what has been said so far. And finally, Emma testifies that a dirty blackguard letter sent to her by John a few days earlier was the main reason for shooting the man. The Times and Democrat write, the verdict was that the deceased came to his death from a gunshot wound inflicted by Miss Emma Connolly. In other words, the grand jury gave an indictment of murder, the first of its kind in the South Carolina courts, and I think in the world. But correct me if you can find an earlier woman shooter. There were obviously women killers before this, including poisoners like Locusta and Yulia Tofana, but this is the earliest recorded case I have found of a woman shooting someone in cold blood. Emma, and this is a direct quote from the Times and Democrat on July 8th, did not like the idea of being confined in jail, and for this reason concluded to wait until court meets, when she will probably demand trial. And another quote directly from the article, She returned home this evening and will remain there if not molested by the officers of the law until next week. So in other words, since she didn't want to spend a week in jail, she just went home. Though a police officer could come and arrest her, they probably won't. While friends and family of both parties are saddened by this murder, most of the public sentiment was actually on her side. Though the News and Courier wrote on the 12th that the Steedley family wants Emma prosecuted for murder and believe that her brother and Mr. Ott are even more guilty than she is. However, the article continued saying, Barnwell County has always been sympathetic towards women in trouble. This case, naturally enough, causes the ear of the noble old country to bleed and arouses all the sentiment of her gallant sons. But the author hoped nonetheless that, quote, the time has not arrived where 12 men selected from the good citizens of our county can trust the whisper of their consciences so completely as to totally ignore the breach of a law so high as that of murder. So the positive sentiment for Emma wasn't 100%, but it seemed particularly strong heading into the trial. The Connolly family also denies that there was a, quote, circulation of a subscription paper for her defense, as reported in News and Courier on the 11th, which is to say that they did not take donations to pay for her attorneys, and they also said that they had great confidence in their attorneys to establish her justification in killing John. On her way to court, Emma said that she doesn't regret her actions and would totally do it again if she'd failed. In the Abbeville Messenger, they wrote, as far as can be ascertained, the feeling of the public seems to favor Miss Connelly, who is under arrest. And again, almost every paper I consulted said a version of the same thing. The friends and family of John do everything they can to secure Emma's conviction, including hiring the Honorable D.S. Henderson to help the solicitor of the Second Circuit, W.P. Murphy, prosecute the case. But as News and Courier on July 8th writes, it is not generally believed that she can be convicted by any jury in Barnwell County. And they also comment that Emma, quote, is said to manifest the utmost indifference and has displayed no unusual nervousness. In fact, she seems to be more self-possessed than any of her friends. And so she stood trial the next week on July 14th. The courthouse was packed because of the spectacle of a white woman who murdered a white man in a church in 1886. And of course, everyone is expecting that some intense revelations will be made at trial. In other words, what is this salacious piece of gossip that he died over? Was the question running through most minds in the courthouse that day. Emma, her father, brother, and two of her sisters entered the courtroom around 9:30 a.m. The News and Courier dedicated 27 lines to describing how she looked. I put it on the screen, but the microfiche print is not the greatest. So here are some of the key points. Her hair is dark and glossy, and it's worn down on a smooth and intellectual forehead. Her eyes are brown and lustrous, with long drooping lashes. Her face somewhat round and full, but exquisitely proportioned, and her complexion is ordinarily pale, but was today slightly flushed from the atmosphere of the courtroom. She was attired in a well-fitting white pique dress, trimmed with lace, and a high lace collar with gold ornament. Her hat was of yellow straw, trimmed with cream satin ribbons, and decorated with ostrich tips. A beauty veil and black vase completed her costume. In her lap was lying a small hand satchel, and she had in her hand, never laying it aside, a small fan which she from time to time used with the semblance of at least utter unconsciousness. She was subject, of course, to the gaze of nearly every person in the courtroom, but she stayed entirely unmoved throughout the trial. Judge Wallace presided over the trial, and a jury of 12 white men was easily formed. The first witness the prosecution called was J.B. Hunter. This is the judge Emma surrendered herself to immediately after the shooting, and the other man that disarmed her along with her father. Judge Hunter said that John had a pistol on him, but he didn't know the man to be in the habit of regularly carrying a pistol, and he also didn't see him trying to draw the pistol, only fleeing. Jacob Rentz, the deacon at the church and a witness from the inquest, is also called to the stand. He stated that he saw Emma enter and heard the shot, but he didn't actually see her shoot John the first time. However, he saw her point the gun at John as he fled out the back door. He said it seemed like she pulled the trigger a few more times because the gun clicked, but for whatever reason it didn't fire. The third witness, James Carter, reiterated basically the same story as the other two, but clarifies that John had walked and not ran out the back door. The shooting created a commotion, but there didn't really seem to be anyone between Emma and John. He also says that she tried to shoot him 2 more times, but the gun didn't fire. The fourth witness was Dr. J.F. Baggett, the doctor from the inquest. He said basically the same thing, but added that considering the direction of the bullet, the shooter must have stood above and behind John when she fired. The defense attempted to use the notes Steedley had written as evidence several times, but the judge declared them inadmissible each time. For instance, the defense handed J.F. Cook, one of John's friends, the letter that he had written to News and Courier. It was immediately ruled inadmissible. Later, defense asked Cook if he recognized John's handwriting on a blackguard note defaming Emma. The prosecution again objected. The judge looked at it and declared it incompetent and irrelevant because it doesn't prove anything as to the, quote, real issue before the court, and it just defamed Emma. The defense then brought up 6 character witnesses, each of whom had known Emma over a decade, all saying that with this exception, they all knew her general character to be good. Finally, what the whole crowd was waiting for, Emma takes the stand. Except for a light flushing from being the center of attention, Emma maintained her sang-froid, while the audience sat on the edge of their seats awaiting the juicy details. Emma fearlessly and confidently met every question without even the hint of a lip quiver. The defense asked Emma to describe the contents of some of the letters, which was immediately objected to and thrown out. All in all, she's not really allowed to say much more than that she killed John because he slandered her, and that she returned his ring after he betrayed her in this way. At this point, Mr. Williams, one of Emma's attorneys, asked the court to adjourn and allow him time to prove to the court that the letters are admissible. Judge Wallace states coldly that he'd already ruled on that point, and if he was in error, then it could be addressed in an appeal. So at this point, closing arguments were made. They mostly reiterated the cases already made. However, Mr. Williams for the defense said about Emma that, quote, he regretted that there were not many more such women in South Carolina, which caused the audience to break out in applause. That was immediately put to a stop by the judge, of course. But the message was that the sentiment was clearly on Emma's side as the jury left to deliberate at 4 p.m. The jury returned at 4:25 p.m. with a verdict of not guilty. Silence spread across the courtroom before erupting in a standing ovation. Then almost the whole audience jumped the railing and flooded the front part of the courtroom, surrounding her and hiding her from view. The townspeople surrounded her for a good 5 or 10 minutes while they all got in on the action. Emma stood there just shaking everyone's hands, but eventually realized the crowd is too dense for her to get out of the front door, so the judge lets her exit through the judge's room. As she walked by the seated Judge Wallace, she stopped, hesitated, and blushed, before reaching out to the judge to shake his hand. They shook hands cordially, and then she left. This case might seem pretty weird to a modern audience because the mores have changed quite a lot since 1886, and so have the laws. But what's fascinating about this case is twofold. First, because of the time period, her case is essentially arguing that destroying a woman's reputation is a type of civil death, because John's rumor spreading was essentially ruining her life. Civil death is a term that refers to the loss of the rights of a citizen to engage in a society. An outlaw, or someone who's been kicked out of town, is a really common example of someone civilly dead because in essence they're no longer allowed to participate in the community. So Emma's case is that a woman in 1880s South Carolina with a ruined reputation is basically legally dead because she doesn't have a future. Or as I quoted from her above, she said, quote, "My name, and that's all a woman has been vilified, and I have wiped out the stain with the blood of my traducer." In other words, his action of vilifying her has threatened her ability to have a life in the area at all, because as one can likely assume, she's getting at ideas like many men would no longer want to marry her, she would be socially ostracized in a way that would stop her from living a normal life, people would talk about her, etc., etc. And all of these things are going to prevent her from living the life that she deserves as a pure, morally righteous woman. Exploring this position, the Greenville News writes, "This case is peculiar in several respects, but mainly in that it brings out strong and clear the love for woman's honor and the steadfast determination to preserve that honor at whatever cost, wherein lies the purity of Southern society and institutions." The jurors, when they returned the verdict of not guilty, did not set aside the fact that Miss Connelly had killed the man whose murder she was charged. What they did do was declare their conviction that she was justified in killing the man who had calumniated her. The verdict was not an acquittal of Miss Connelly. It was a condemnation of the man who dared to cast dishonor upon a woman's name. The vote of 12 jurors were not intended to constitute an approval of Miss Connelly's act. What they ought to be considered is as a sentence of immediate and consummate punishment for every offender against the purity of woman's name. They continue to bemoan, however, that there is still a problem in this ruling, as it could create an unintended new danger, which is that, quote, "woman's reputation cannot be too carefully guarded, but it can best be guarded by a woman's God-created protector, man." When punishment is placed in her own hands, the act comes near the line that separated the woman from the female, which for a modern reader is kind of a head-scratcher of a moral position, but remember, it's 1886. And this blurb also gives us a window into the ideological positions of these townfolks who acquitted Emma. On the same token, though, she's also aware that her father or brother would likely be convicted of murder for the same offense, stating, "I killed him because I felt it my duty, and I did not want to put my father or brother in the position that I am now in." And if pushed on this, Emma or her attorneys would likely argue something like, this is a different choice because the men's lives were not necessarily disadvantaged by this, other than maybe having to allow Emma to live with them for the rest of their life. In other words, the sort of moral justice that she's getting here is something only she could get. Only she's justified in it because only she's experiencing the civil death. And this was the point of the few opposing opinions. For instance, about a week earlier on July 6th, the Watchman in Southron wrote about the chapter of horrors created by South Carolina juries, quote, turning murderers loose upon the people, by which I think they mean not holding people in jail with no bail after the murder. They specifically point out this story, but also several recent cases, including 2 farmers who shot each other, a man who was hacked to pieces by 2 brothers, and another man who stabbed someone in the neck during a fight. This court decision seems like more of what that author, at least, was hoping would stop, as this was written just 2 days after the Hunter's Chapel shooting. And as published in The Watchman in Southron, the Carolina Spartan writes the exact opposite sentiment of the verdict, stating, quote, "So far as the published statements of the trial go, there was no proof of slander except her own statements on the stand. She was not only acquitted, but there was a grand ovation. The courthouse was a scene of handshaking and boisterous exultation on the part of friends. Has it come to this in South Carolina that any woman can with impunity and without fear of imprisonment before or after trial shoot down any man who in her opinion has slandered her? If the slander really exists, can the character of a good, pure, upright woman be defended or strengthened by deliberately killing the slanderer? This to me is the ultimate question here. How does murdering someone that slanders you make you a good, pure, upright woman? Wouldn't that too besmirch your name? So how specifically did she fix this issue with her action of murder? Along these lines, the defense, it seems at least to me, played on this exact sensibility and the spectacle of showing those letters and wanting the letters to be shown. Because in a certain sense, this is like playing chicken with the court. If the slander actually created a civil death for Emma, then the court exposing this information would in a certain sense nullify the man's death if this was a just killing to protect her honor. And in that same line of thinking, exposing the information would also subject her to the exact same civil death she sought so hard to avoid that she killed a man in order to get him to stop slandering her. And so on a logical level, it seems like if she was justified in killing John, then the whole court would also be guilty of slandering her. Seems like a literal, I could tell you, but I'd have to kill you kind of thing. Finally, and this is probably less lost in a modern audience, but by shooting him in a crowded place, she endangered the lives of so many people. Who knows who else could have been hit with a bullet or shrapnel, especially if she had a fully loaded pistol because it could hold at least 5 bullets. She could have injured enough people to be the first female mass shooter entirely by accident. So is there an inherent danger to leaving murderers, even if seemingly morally justified, free? Especially those who recklessly endangered the lives of other people in situations where their life is not in immediate danger? Can we consider this idea of losing your honor as actually being in immediate danger? And should additional consequences be assigned for negligence? As the News and Courier writes, quote, "The juror who lightly acquits a murderer of his crime becomes a partaker of that crime and shares the guilt of the criminal whom he rescues from a deserved punishment." And while it's still arguably not perfect, luckily for us over a century later, our legal system does a much better job of taking these kinds of things into account. Okay, so I kept you hanging long enough. I know you've been asking, so what's the gossip? And sadly, this secret is almost as well kept as the US nuclear launch codes. Everyone knows it was something salacious. What exactly is hard to say. From the case in general, and specifically what's written in the Columbus Inquirer's Sun, it seems as if they had been intimate in some way, and he had disclosed that to a friend. For instance, in the Columbia Inquirer's Sun, they write that the woman, quote, is his co-partner in guilt. So it likely wasn't about him cheating. It's hard to say what it is specifically, though, as this is the Victorian era after all. But one can likely assume that they got somewhere between second base and a home run. The journalist continues, "A man who will betray the secret confidence of a woman who has been his co-partner in guilt may not be more of a criminal, but he is less of a man. Stolen waters are sweet, but there is an honor even among thieves. In this case, it was not the secret sin, but the boastful and treacherous betrayal of it that cost Steedley his life." In other words, telling his friend is what ruined her reputation, and reiterating things like, "Her mother knows the whole truth and knows that I have not lied," probably did not help his case for forgiveness. So what do you think? Thinking about 1886 South Carolina, was this the right decision? Is destroying a woman's honor really the same as civil death at that time? After all, in the 1880s, it was difficult to sit on a jury, hold office, or be a witness if you were an atheist. So good Christian folks made all these kinds of decisions for reasons they felt justified in. So looking back, were the God-fearing times really more moral than now? And what, if any level of defamation, do you think is punishable by death? But of course, many things have changed since then, so please be kind in your responses whether you agree with me or each other or not. We can really be civil here. So drop a comment, like the video, and argue about it with your friends. And honestly, no worries if you do nothing but just enjoy the videos. I aim to drop a new video every Tuesday at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So I'll see you then.